This moment was a prayer whispered across an ocean of war and misfortune for 3 long years. The faces of his daughter and his granddaughter were a phantom light that guided Governor John White back to the edge of the world, back to the small sandbar of Roanoke to find his family, to find his colony. But as his boots sink into the sand, the first wave of a deep unease begins to wash over him. The shore is empty. There are no watchmen, no sound of children playing, no smoke rising from the settlement he designed. There is only the wind, a sound that feels less like a welcome and more like a warning. Every step towards the high palisade is a step into a deeper silence, a silence that feels wrong, artificial, profound. He had left a bustling town, but he has returned to find a fortress meant to protect his family, now standing as their tombstone, marked only by a single cryptic word carved into the wood. The story of Roanoke begins in the heart of a rival empire. It is a story that was written in the gold mines of Peru and the silver mountains of Mexico. For in the latter half of the 16th century, the world belonged to the Iberian powers of Spain and Portugal. Theirs was a truly global dominion, stretching from the shipyards of Lisbon to the spice ports of the East Indies, to the vast, conquered territories of the New World. This was the Spanish Golden Age, an era of unprecedented wealth and power. Every year, the great treasure fleets, the floater, would cross the Atlantic in heavily armed convoys. They carried a king's ransom in bullion, funding the most powerful armies in Europe, and fueling a Catholic empire that saw itself as God's chosen instrument on earth. The galleons were floating fortresses, symbols of an imperial machine that appeared unstoppable. King Philip II of Spain was the most powerful man in the world. From his palace monastery of El Escorial, he governed a sprawling bureaucracy that administered continents. His gaze was fixed on 2 primary objectives: the consolidation of Catholic authority against the rising tide of the Protestant Reformation, and the complete and total domination of the Americas. The New World was his private estate, its immense resources his personal treasury. This Iberian juggernaut functioned as a source of both immense frustration and existential dread for the other nations of Europe. To challenge Spain was to challenge a global economic and military system. The gold of the Americas gave Philip the power to interfere in the politics of every neighboring kingdom, to fund wars, and to assert his claim as the great defender of the Catholic faith. Any attempt to colonize the Americas was, in his eyes, an act of theft and heresy. England, under the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I, felt this pressure most acutely. The nation was a small, defiant island on the edge of a continent dominated by Philip's influence. English sailors and merchants who dared to venture into Spanish-controlled waters were treated as pirates and heretics, often captured, tortured by the Inquisition, or executed. This created a simmering national resentment, a sense that England's destiny was being suffocated by an empire that claimed the world for itself. This simmering English resentment found its outlet in a new generation of mariner. These were the Sea Dogs, a collection of brilliant navigators, ruthless fighters, and devoted patriots from the coastal counties of Devon and Cornwall. Men like John Hawkins and his younger cousin, Francis Drake, who saw the Spanish Empire as a treasure chest waiting to be opened. They operated as state-sanctioned privateers, blurring the line between piracy and patriotism. Their strategy was one of asymmetric warfare. England lacked the resources to challenge the Spanish Navy in a conventional fleet action, so the Sea Dogs used smaller, faster, and more maneuverable ships, like Drake's legendary galleon, the Golden Hind. They would stalk the Spanish sea lanes, striking with terrifying speed and precision, capturing treasure ships, and raiding poorly defended colonial ports throughout the Caribbean. To the Spanish, these men were demonic pirates. El Drake, or the Dragon, was their name for Francis Drake, a figure of immense terror. His raids were audacious, penetrating the Pacific Ocean, which Spain considered a private lake, and circumnavigating the globe in the process. These voyages were epic feats of endurance and navigation, demonstrating English maritime skill to a stunned and outraged world. This campaign of piracy was secretly and brilliantly orchestrated by Queen Elizabeth herself. Publicly, she could deny any involvement, claiming the Sea Dogs were rogue criminals. Privately, she was a major shareholder in their voyages, providing ships and letters of reprisal that gave their actions a thin veneer of legality. This policy of plausible deniability allowed her to wage a proxy war, weakening her great rival without declaring open hostilities. The financial returns from these expeditions were astronomical. Drake's circumnavigation of the globe yielded a profit of over 4,000% to his investors, including the Queen. The captured Spanish bullion effectively doubled the annual revenue of the English crown. It paid off the entire national debt and allowed Elizabeth to invest heavily in a new, modern navy. This influx of capital fundamentally transformed England's economic and military potential. The success of the Sea Dogs did more than fill the treasury. It created a profound psychological shift within the English nation. The Spanish juggernaut now seemed vulnerable. Its control of the New World was clearly breakable. This newfound confidence, funded by Spanish gold, gave rise to a far grander and more complex ambition. It was the ambition to move beyond simple raiding and to plant a permanent English dagger in the heart of the Spanish Americas. The champion of this new ambition was a man who perfectly embodied the spirit of the age. Sir Walter Raleigh was a poet, a soldier, a courtier, and an explorer, a product of the Devon gentry who engineered his own rise through a potent combination of intellect, charisma, and unwavering self-belief. He possessed a unique ability to capture the imagination of the court, and most importantly, of the Queen herself. Raleigh was a veteran of the brutal English campaigns in Ireland, and a stepbrother to the adventurer Sir Humphrey Gilbert. He had seen the mechanics of colonization firsthand, its potential for wealth, and its capacity for violence. He understood that England's future lay beyond its shores, and he saw the vast, unclaimed territories of North America as the perfect stage for his own grand designs. He became the central advocate for a new colonial policy, one that moved beyond the smash-and-grab raids of the Sea Dogs. Raleigh's vision was for a permanent English settlement in the New World. This Virginia, named in honor of his patron, the Virgin Queen, would serve multiple strategic purposes. It would be a base for privateering against the Spanish treasure fleets, a source of valuable commodities, and a projection of English power that would directly challenge Philip II's dominion. In 1584, Raleigh's powers of persuasion yielded their greatest result. Queen Elizabeth granted him a royal patent, a charter that gave him the right to discover, hold, occupy, and govern any remote lands not already in the possession of any Christian prince. This document was the legal foundation for the Roanoke voyages. The patent was a masterclass in the Elizabethan model of privatized imperialism. The Crown granted the authority, but took on almost none of the financial risk. Raleigh himself was responsible for raising the capital, recruiting the colonists, and organizing the logistics of the entire venture. The potential profits were his to keep, but so too was the catastrophic risk of failure. The fate of the colony would depend entirely on the deep pockets and unwavering commitment of its private backers. With the royal patent secured, Raleigh's next task was to sell the dream of America to the English people. He needed investors to fund the venture, and he needed colonists willing to populate it. This required a powerful propaganda campaign to transform the dangerous and unknown American coast into a land of opportunity. The chief architects of this campaign were two cousins, both named Richard Hakluyt. The Hakluyts were the intellectual engine of English expansion. The elder, a lawyer, and the younger, a geographer, were obsessed with collecting every map, journal, and sailor's report they could find. They were master compilers of information, and they understood that knowledge was the key to overseas power. In 1584, at Raleigh's request, the younger Hakluyt produced a secret report for the Queen, his Discourse of Western Planting. This document was the foundational text of the English Empire in America. It laid out a comprehensive argument for colonization. A North American settlement would provide exotic goods, create a new market for English cloth, and act as a Protestant bulwark against the spread of Spanish Catholicism. It also argued that converting the Native Americans to Protestantism was a holy duty, framing the entire colonial project as a divine mission. The arguments of the Hakluyts were soon popularized in printed pamphlets and sermons. These publications painted a seductive and deliberately misleading picture of the Outer Banks. They described it as a new Eden, a land of gentle natives, fertile soil that required little work, and harbors overflowing with fish. It was a carefully constructed fantasy designed to appeal to landless farmers, ambitious artisans, and second sons with no inheritance. This propaganda campaign was incredibly effective. It tapped into the economic anxieties and the nascent national pride of Elizabethan England. The reports from Raleigh's first exploratory voyage in 1584, which brought Manteo and Wanchese to England, seemed to confirm the most optimistic claims. The stage was now set. The idea had been formulated, the legal authority granted, and the public imagination captured. The next step was to transform this dream into reality. It was time to dispatch the first colony. This initial attempt, however, would be a military garrison, a hardened spear point designed to secure a foothold through force. It would be led by a veteran of the Irish Wars, a man whose brutal methods would poison the soil of the new world for all who followed. Among the soldiers and fortune seekers of that first 1585 military expedition was a man with a very different purpose. His name was John White, a gentleman artist and cartographer from London. His primary role was that of an observer, a visual chronicler tasked by Walter Raleigh with an assignment of immense importance. He was to create a precise, accurate, and compelling record of this new land, its resources, and its people. This was a crucial part of Raleigh's long-term strategy. The Hakluyts could write glowing prose about a new Eden, but it was White's images that would make it real for investors back in England. His watercolors were the visual evidence, the proof of concept for the entire colonial enterprise. They were a tool of promotion, designed to showcase the potential wealth and strategic value of Virginia. White's partner in this endeavor was the brilliant young scientist and mathematician Thomas Harriot. While White captured the world in images, Harriot documented it in words and data. He studied the Algonquian language, catalogued the native flora and fauna, and experimented with planting English crops. Together, they formed a scientific and artistic team, working to systematically understand and translate a world that was utterly alien to European experience. Their work was undertaken with a sense of genuine intellectual curiosity. White was a skilled draftsman, trained in the emerging tradition of Renaissance realism. He painted what he saw with a remarkable degree of accuracy and a deep empathy for his subjects. His paintings are historical documents of the highest order, providing a window into a moment of cultural contact before it was irrevocably broken by conflict. John White's most valuable work centered on the Carolina Algonquian peoples who had inhabited this land for centuries. His paintings function as detailed ethnographic studies, capturing the nuances of a sophisticated and well-ordered society. He painted village leaders, religious figures, and warriors, taking care to document their specific clothing, body paint, and ceremonial regalia. These portraits are infused with a sense of individual dignity and presence. He painted the village of Pomeook, showing its construction of arched, mat-covered longhouses. He documented their religious life, sketching the interior of a temple containing the preserved bodies of their former chiefs. His work reveals a deep fascination with the structure and beliefs of Algonquian culture, presenting them to his European audience as a complex and organized civilization. His masterpiece of cultural observation is the painting of the village of CROATOAN. This single image is a narrative map of community life. It shows their homes, their agricultural fields with corn in 3 different stages of growth, and a hunting party returning from the forest. It depicts a ceremonial dance, a feast, and a sacred fire where rituals are performed. It is a holistic view of a functioning, sustainable community, living in deep connection with its environment. White's paintings also captured the daily rhythms of Algonquian life. He painted men fishing with spears in the shallows, and women tending to their families. He created a remarkable image showing their method of cooking, broiling fish over an open fire on a wooden grate. These seemingly simple scenes are invaluable, providing a rich, humanizing portrait of a people and a way of life that would soon be threatened by the arrival of the English. These images were revolutionary for their time. Most European depictions of Native Americans were monstrous or cartoonish caricatures designed to portray them as savage heathens. White's work, by contrast, is grounded in direct observation and a palpable sense of respect. His Algonquian subjects are portrayed as thoughtful, powerful, and deeply human. This nuanced perspective, however, was often lost in translation. When White's watercolors were later engraved by Theodore de Bry to illustrate a published version of Harriot's report, they were significantly altered. De Bry, who had never been to America, redrew the figures to look more like classical European nudes. The specific, human details of White's original paintings were changed to fit a preconceived European ideal, a subtle but powerful act of cultural mistranslation. This gap between White's direct observation and its European reception is central to the story of Roanoke. The English saw what they wanted to see: a land of potential riches and a people who could be converted or swept aside. They failed to appreciate the complexity of the society White had so carefully documented, a failure of understanding that would have devastating consequences. Beyond its people, John White's brush also captured the exotic flora and fauna of the Carolina coast. He painted swallowtail butterflies, loggerhead turtles, and the strange and wonderful scorpion fish. His detailed images of the milkweed plant and the sable palm were the first time these species had ever been accurately depicted for European eyes. These paintings reinforced the image of a land of incredible natural abundance. This seeming paradise of the Outer Banks, however, concealed significant dangers. White's own maps documented the treacherous shoals and shallow inlets that made the area a graveyard for ships. The colonists also learned quickly of the region's violent coastal storms, which could appear with terrifying speed. This was a dynamic and often hostile environment, one that demanded local knowledge and respect. The most significant danger was one that White and Harriet could observe, but could not fully comprehend. Tree ring data from ancient bald cypress trees in the region has revealed a stark truth. The arrival of the English in 1585 coincided with the beginning of the most extreme drought in the past 800 years. This environmental catastrophe would parch the soil, wither crops, and place an unbearable strain on the food resources of both the natives and the newcomers. The English colonists had arrived in a land of supposed plenty at the precise moment it was tipping into a state of ecological crisis. Their imported seeds, like wheat and barley, were unsuited for the sandy soil and failed to thrive in the dry conditions. The Algonquians, with their deep agricultural knowledge, also struggled to produce a surplus. This scarcity would become the engine of conflict, turning hopeful encounters into desperate and violent confrontations. The first English colony in the New World was a military operation, composed entirely of soldiers and specialists. Its governor was Sir Ralph Lane, a career soldier whose entire experience of colonization came from the brutal English subjugation of Ireland. He viewed the Algonquian people through that lens, as a native population to be intimidated, controlled, and exploited for resources. The mission of Lane's garrison of 107 men was to secure a foothold, search for gold and deep-water ports, and establish English authority in the region. They constructed a small, star-shaped earthwork fort on the northern end of Roanoke Island. This Fort Raleigh was their base of operations, a symbol of English power planted in a land whose complex social and ecological realities they completely failed to grasp. The growing drought immediately put the garrison in a perilous position. Their own attempts at farming failed, making them entirely dependent on the local Algonquian tribes for food. From the very beginning, their relationship with the natives was one of coercive dependency. Lane's men had metal tools and powerful guns, but the Algonquians had the corn and fish needed to survive the coming winter. This imbalance created a climate of immediate and escalating tension. The English saw the Algonquians' reluctance to trade their dwindling food reserves as treachery. The Algonquians saw the English soldiers as a powerful, arrogant, and parasitic force that was draining the resources of the entire region. The stage was set for a violent collision. The leader of the Roanoke people, who controlled the island and the adjacent mainland, was the chief Wingina. He was a shrewd and calculating leader who initially saw the English as powerful potential allies in his regional rivalries. He provided them with food and information, hoping to leverage their advanced technology for his own purposes. This initial phase of cooperation, however, quickly soured. The catalyst for open conflict was a seemingly minor incident. During an exploratory expedition, one of Lane's men accused a native from the village of Aquascagok of stealing a silver cup. In response, Lane authorized a brutal and wildly disproportionate reprisal. The English attacked and burned the entire village to the ground for the crime of a single, unproven theft. This act of collective punishment was a profound violation of Algonquian custom and diplomacy. It demonstrated to Wingina that the English were not honorable allies, but a volatile and unpredictably violent force. He began to actively organize a broad-based resistance, uniting several previously rivalrous tribes with the shared goal of expelling the English from their lands. His strategy was to cut off their food supply entirely, letting the drought and starvation do the work of a direct assault. Ralph Lane learned of Wingina's plan through informants. He chose to respond with a preemptive strike of his own. In June of 1586, Lane and his men attacked Wingina's capital on the northern end of Roanoke Island, under the pretense of a friendly visit. The attack was a slaughter. The English soldiers opened fire on the assembled chiefs, and in the ensuing chaos, Wingina himself was shot. Wounded, he fled into the woods, pursued by two of Lane's soldiers. One of them, an Irishman named Edward Nugent, returned a short time later carrying the chief's severed head. Ralph Lane had decapitated the leadership of the Roanoke people, creating a legacy of blood and terror that would never be forgotten. The assassination of Wingina made the English colony's position untenable. Ralph Lane had proven his capacity for extreme violence, but he had also destroyed any possibility of trade or diplomacy. The Algonquian people, now united in their hatred for the English, launched a campaign of guerrilla warfare, harassing any soldiers who dared to venture outside the fort. Starvation became an imminent threat. With the local food supply completely cut off, Lane's men were reduced to eating their own dogs and foraging for roots in the woods, where they were subject to constant attack. The military solution had failed completely. The garrison, designed to project power, was now a prison, its inhabitants besieged by a hostile population and a blighted landscape. Their salvation arrived by chance in June of 1586. Sir Francis Drake, sailing home after a massive and successful raid on Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, paid a visit to Roanoke to check on the colony's progress. He found a starving, desperate, and terrified group of men. Lane, recognizing that his position was hopeless, made the decision to abandon the first English colony in the New World. The soldiers departed with such haste that they left behind several chests of records, including, most likely, many of John White's original paintings and surveys. They left a legacy of fear and bitterness among the native people, a reputation for brutality that would be remembered. The first attempt to plant an English dagger in the heart of the Spanish Americas had ended in a frantic and humiliating retreat. To understand the complex relationship that would define the Roanoke colony, we must return to the very beginning. We must go back to the summer of 1584, to Walter Raleigh's first exploratory expedition under Captains Amadas and Barlow. It was this initial voyage that made the first sustained contact with the Algonquian people, and it was on this voyage that two native men made a fateful decision to journey across the sea. Their names were Manteo and Wanchese. Manteo was a member of the CROATOAN people, a tribe whose territory included the barrier islands of Hatteras. Wanchese was a warrior from the Roanoke tribe, the same people who would later be led by Wingina. Their selection to accompany the English back home was a deliberate strategic choice, both for the explorers and for the Algonquian leaders themselves. For the English, Manteo and Wanchese were living proof of the New World's promise. They were meant to be cultural translators, learning English and providing invaluable intelligence about the land, its resources, and its politics. For their own people, the two men were emissaries, sent on a dangerous mission to scout the English homeland, to gauge their power, and to understand the intentions of these strange, heavily armed newcomers. From the very beginning, the two men seem to have embodied two different responses to the English arrival. Manteo, whose people had more experience with trade and outsiders, displayed a consistent curiosity and a willingness to engage. He saw the English as potential partners, a powerful new element that could be incorporated into his world. His path would be one of alliance and adaptation. Wanchese, hailing from the more powerful and insulated Roanoke tribe, was far more skeptical. He viewed the English with the wary eye of a warrior sizing up a potential threat. He saw their technology and their numbers as a danger to the established order of his people. His path would be one of resistance and rejection. These two men, traveling together into the heart of a foreign empire, would become the human faces of a cultural collision. The arrival of Manteo and Wanchese in London in the autumn of 1584 caused a sensation. They were presented at court and became the living embodiment of Raleigh's Virginia project. London itself presented a bewildering and overwhelming sensory experience for the two Algonquian men. Its sheer scale, the density of its population, and the constant noise were a world away from the forested shores of the Outer Banks. They were placed in the care of Thomas Harriot, the scientist and linguist. It was Harriot's job to teach them English and, in turn, to learn as much as he could about the Algonquian language and culture. This collaboration was immensely fruitful. Harriot developed a phonetic alphabet for the Algonquian language and quickly became the foremost English expert on their society. During this time in London, the two men were shown the pinnacles of English power. They likely saw the Tower of London with its royal menagerie and its formidable armoury. They witnessed the incredible wealth of the merchant class and the elaborate ceremony of Queen Elizabeth's court. The English intended these displays to impress their visitors with an image of overwhelming strength and sophistication. These demonstrations of power had a profoundly different effect on each man. For Manteo, the evidence of English wealth and military might confirm his belief that they would be powerful allies. He saw their technology as a tool that could benefit his own people, and he formed a genuine friendship with Thomas Harriot. He chose to trust the English and their promises. For Wanchese, the experience had the opposite effect. He saw the deep social inequality of London, the poverty and the disease that festered in the crowded streets. He saw the thousands of landless, desperate people and understood that this was a society with an insatiable hunger for new territory. He viewed the English military power not as a promise of alliance, but as a dire threat to his home. Manteo and Wanchese returned to their homeland in the spring of 1585, sailing with the military garrison of Sir Ralph Lane. Their year abroad had transformed them from emissaries into symbols of two irreconcilable futures. Their return to Roanoke marked their final separation into opposing sides of a coming conflict. They were no longer just two men, they were a living prophecy of the colony's fate. Wanchese immediately returned to his people and his chief, Wingina. He provided a detailed and alarming report of what he had seen in England. He described a massive, overcrowded nation with a fearsome military capacity, and a desperate need for land. His testimony was instrumental in turning Wingina's initial policy of cautious cooperation into one of deep-seated hostility. One Chase's warnings became the strategic intelligence behind the Algonquian resistance. Manteo, in stark contrast, remained with the English. He served as a crucial guide and translator for Ralph Lane and Thomas Harriot. His loyalty to his new allies, however, placed him in an impossible position. He was increasingly isolated from his own people, viewed as a collaborator with the violent and demanding newcomers. He witnessed Lane's brutal methods firsthand, a reality that must have severely tested his faith in the English. His loyalty, however, was repaid by the English in 1587 with the arrival of the second colony. John White, recognizing Manteo's unwavering support, staged a formal ceremony on Roanoke Island. On the orders of Sir Walter Raleigh, Manteo was baptized into the Church of England and was granted the feudal title of Lord of Roanoke and Dassamongpuk. He became the first and last Native American peer of the English realm. This act, intended as an honor, was a profound demonstration of English mistranslation. They were rewarding their only true friend with a set of titles and concepts that had no meaning in Algonquian society. For the English, it was a way to secure a land claim. For Manteo, it was the final step in a journey that had led him from his own world into a new one, a loyal ally to a people who would soon vanish, leaving him stranded between the memory of his past and a future that would never arrive. The failure of the Ralph Lane garrison was a costly and humiliating setback for Sir Walter Raleigh. It proved that a colony built on intimidation and military force alone could not sustain itself. Raleigh, ever the innovator, processed this failure and pivoted his strategy entirely. He concluded that the foundation of a successful colony was investment, both financial and personal. To that end, he created a new corporate structure in 1587. This was a private joint stock venture named the Governor and Assistants of the City of Raleigh in Virginia. It allowed Raleigh to spread the immense financial risk of colonization among a group of wealthy London merchants and gentlemen. Each investor purchased a share in the enterprise, hoping for a massive return on their investment from the future profits of the colony. The most revolutionary aspect of this new model was the primary incentive it offered. Every colonist who invested and traveled to Virginia would be granted a large tract of land, at least 500 acres. This was a radical idea. It transformed the colonists from mere employees or soldiers into stakeholders. They were being offered the chance to own a piece of America, a powerful dream for the land-hungry people of Elizabethan England. The offer of land fundamentally changed the nature of the colonial population. The new expedition was comprised of men, women, and children, a true settler community. Raleigh's new design was based on the strategic insight that soldiers seek conquest, but families seek stability. A settlement of families would be more invested in building a permanent, self-sustaining society. This new, civilian-focused venture required a different kind of leader. Ralph Lane, the soldier, was replaced by John White, the artist. White was one of the few Englishmen with extensive, direct experience of the land and its people. His temperament as an observer and a diplomat made him the ideal choice to lead a colony intended to survive through agriculture and trade rather than by force. The 90 men, 17 women, and 9 children who agreed to sail with White were primarily middle-class Londoners. They were artisans, craftsmen, and farmers, the kind of practical people needed to build a new society from the ground up. Among them was John White's own pregnant daughter, Eleanor, and her husband, a bricklayer named Ananias Dare. The fate of the governor was now inextricably and tragically tied to the fate of his own family. For these families, the promise of America was the promise of a new life. In England, land was the ultimate measure of wealth and status, and it was controlled by a small aristocracy. In Virginia, a common man could become a lord of his own 500 acres. This was the powerful, transformative dream that convinced them to risk everything on a perilous Atlantic crossing. Their intended destination was the Chesapeake Bay, a location chosen for its superior harbors and agricultural potential. The reports from the Lane colony, for all their failures, had correctly identified the Outer Banks as a dangerous and unsuitable location for a permanent settlement. The plan was to sail to Roanoke, only to pick up a small holding party of men that Lane had left behind, and then to move north immediately to establish the city of Raleigh on the shores of the Chesapeake. In May of 1587, the 3 small ships, carrying the hopes of 117 colonists, weighed anchor and set sail for the New World. They were leaving behind an overcrowded and turbulent England for a life of freedom and opportunity. They sailed with a clear plan, a new leader, and a new vision for an English America. They were unaware that the legacy of the first colony, the ambitions of a single ship's pilot, and the devastating reality of a multi-year drought were all waiting to converge upon them and to doom their venture before it ever truly began. The hope that filled the colonists as they left England began to fray almost immediately. The reason for this was a single, powerful man, Simon Fernandez. A Portuguese pilot in the employ of the English, Fernandez was arguably the most experienced mariner in the Atlantic. He had sailed to the Outer Banks multiple times and was the trusted navigator for all of Raleigh's ventures. He was also a man who was deeply distrusted by many of his English colleagues. They saw him as a self-serving opportunist, and some even suspected him of being a secret agent of the Spanish. Fernandez operated with a clear personal agenda, viewing the colonists and their mission as secondary to his own objectives. His primary interest was in the lucrative practice of privateering, the hunting of Spanish prize ships in the Caribbean. This created an immediate and unavoidable conflict in the chain of command. John White was the appointed governor of the colony, the man in charge of the people and the mission. Simon Fernandez, as the chief pilot of the fleet, had absolute control over the ships and their destination. This fatal division of authority, a direct result of the venture's privatized nature, placed the entire expedition at the mercy of the pilot's ambition. John White's own journal, our only first-hand account of the voyage, details a journey plagued by a series of deliberate and infuriating detours. Fernandez repeatedly diverted the fleet to chase after potential prize ships. Weeks were lost as he hunted the Spanish sea lanes, treating the colonist-laden vessels as his own privateering squadron. This was a direct violation of his duties, but White was powerless to stop him. Each delay had a cascading effect on the mission's fragile timeline. The colonists' food supplies, carefully rationed for a direct crossing, began to dwindle alarmingly. Fresh water became a constant concern. The slow, meandering journey also meant that they would miss the ideal planting season in Virginia, a critical failure for a colony that needed to become self-sufficient before its first winter. The relationship between Governor White and Pilot Fernandez curdled into one of open animosity. White saw Fernandez as a saboteur, a man who was actively endangering the lives of the men, women, and children on board for his own personal enrichment. Fernandez saw White as an obstacle, and the colony as a tedious obligation to be dispensed with as quickly as possible. This toxic dynamic, playing out in the vast emptiness of the Atlantic, would soon lead to a final, catastrophic decision. By the time the fleet finally reached the Caribbean in late June, the colonists were already in a precarious state. Fernandez's delays meant they had arrived deep into the hurricane season, and their welcome was a series of violent storms. The ships were battered, and the passengers, many already weakened by the long voyage, were pushed to the edge of their endurance. Their primary goal in the West Indies was to take on vital supplies for the final leg of the journey. They needed fresh water, fruit to ward off scurvy, and most importantly, salt to preserve their meat and fish for the winter. At each stop, however, they were met with misfortune. Their search for salt at their planned stop proved fruitless, exacerbating their supply crisis. During a stop to take on fresh water, many of the men consumed contaminated fruit, leading to an outbreak of sickness that swept through the already weakened passengers. John White himself fell gravely ill for several days. The dream of a new Eden was dissolving into a grim reality of disease, hunger, and unrelenting hardship. For Simon Fernandez, the struggling colonists had become a dangerous liability. Their sickness and their needs were slowing him down, cutting into the time he had allotted for his return to the Caribbean for more prize hunting. His impatience grew with every passing day. The mission he had been hired to support was now a frustrating impediment to his own enrichment. In late July, the battered fleet finally arrived off the coast of North Carolina. The weather was poor, and the season was dangerously late for establishing a new settlement. John White gave the order to proceed north to the Chesapeake, as the plan had always dictated. It was at this moment that Simon Fernandez made his final move. The pilot flatly refused the governor's order. He claimed the summer was too far spent, and that it was too dangerous to attempt to navigate a new coastline so close to the autumn hurricane season. It was a thin excuse from a man who had single-handedly wasted that summer hunting for Spanish gold. Fernandez declared that he would take the colonists no further. His true motive was simple greed. Dropping the colonists at Roanoke, the closest and most familiar landfall, would allow him to quickly unburden himself of his passengers. He could then race back to the Caribbean for a final, profitable season of privateering before heading home. The lives and success of the colony were a distant second to that objective. John White furiously protested, but he had no leverage. The sailors were loyal to the pilot who paid their wages, not the governor who was now seen as a liability. White was forced to concede, his authority as governor rendered meaningless by the pilot's control of the ships. The tragedy was a failure of the system itself, a venture so structured that a captain's pursuit of private riches could fatally override a governor's authority and a colony's strategic needs. Their arrival at Roanoke confirmed their worst fears. They found the small fort razed to the ground. The houses Lane had built were overgrown with weeds and vines. Lying on the ground were the sun-bleached bones of a single English soldier, a grim welcome and a stark reminder of the poisoned legacy they had inherited. The holding party of 15 men that had been left by a supply ship the previous year was gone, a mystery that foreshadowed their own. The colonists were hundreds of miles from their intended destination, left in a place known to be hostile, with dwindling supplies, and at the worst possible time of year to plant crops. Their new life in America was beginning in the ruins of a past failure. Within days, Simon Fernandez and his fleet were gone. They disappeared over the horizon, leaving the 117 men, women, and children of the city of Raleigh to fend for themselves. They were stranded, abandoned by their own countrymen, in a land gripped by the worst drought in centuries, a land that had already tasted English blood and was hungry for more. In the midst of the immense hardship and fear that defined their first weeks on Roanoke, a singular event provided the colonists with a powerful flicker of hope. Less than a month after their arrival, on August 18, 1587, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She was the daughter of Eleanor and Ananias Dare and the granddaughter of Governor John White. The birth was both a profound family event and a significant political act. It was a physical manifestation of the colony's purpose, to plant a new generation of English people in the soil of the New World. The child was a tangible link between the present and the future, a sign that their settlement was intended to be permanent, a society of families, not a temporary garrison of soldiers. A few days later, the child was christened in a small, hastily built chapel. She was named Virginia, in honor of the Queen and the new land itself. This ceremony was a declaration of intent. It formally brought the first English Christian born in America into the fold of the church, an act of profound cultural and religious importance to the colonists. It was an attempt to impose a familiar English order onto a wild and uncertain world. For John White, the event was deeply personal. The birth of his granddaughter tied his own bloodline to the fate of the colony in the most intimate way imaginable. His success as a governor was now inseparable from his duty as a grandfather. The survival of this single child became a powerful symbol for the survival of the entire endeavor. Virginia Dare immediately became a potent symbol for the entire colonial enterprise. For the English, her birth was a sign of divine favor, a confirmation that God approved of their venture. She was living proof of their ability to domesticate the wilderness, to plant an English root and make it grow. She represented innocence, a new beginning, and the future prosperity of the city of Raleigh. This symbolism was a powerful psychological comfort for the stranded colonists. In the face of dwindling supplies, a hostile environment, and the crushing reality of their abandonment, the birth was a tangible reason to persevere. It focused their collective will to survive, giving them a cause that was more powerful than mere self-preservation. It was the cause of building a world for their children. For the local Algonquian people, the birth of an English child signified something far more ominous. The soldiers of the Lane colony had been a temporary problem, a violent raiding party that had eventually left. This child was different. A child signified permanence. It was the first sign of a coming wave of settlers who intended to stay, to clear the land, and to claim it for their own. The arrival of English women and the birth of an English child transformed the colonists from a military threat into a demographic one. It was a clear signal that their demand for food and land, already a source of immense tension in a time of drought, was only going to increase. The fragile peace that John White was trying to build was now threatened by the very symbol that gave his own people hope. The child was a promise to the English and a warning to the Algonquians. The brief hope brought by the birth of Virginia Dare was a small light against a darkening sky. As the summer of 1587 wore on, the colony's situation grew more precarious with each passing day. The seeds they had brought from England failed in the sandy, drought-stricken soil. Their attempts to fish and hunt yielded meager returns, far from the effortless abundance promised by the Hakluyt's propaganda. Their supplies, already depleted by the long-delayed voyage, dwindled at an alarming rate. They were consuming their winter stores before autumn had even begun. The colonists, many of whom were city dwellers with little experience in subsistence living, found themselves facing the terrifying prospect of slow starvation. The privatized venture, lacking a deep reserve of supplies, had left them with almost no margin for error. Their relationship with the local native population was equally dire. The memory of Ralph Lane's brutality was a poisoned well. While Manteo's CROATOAN people remained cautiously friendly, the more powerful mainland tribes, led by the successors of Wingina, refused all contact. An early attempt by John White to parley was met with suspicion, and a colonist out hunting for crabs was shot and killed with arrows. This isolated act of violence sent a shockwave of fear through the small community. The colonists responded with a clumsy and ill-advised retaliatory raid. Tragically, they attacked the friendly CROATOAN people by mistake, injuring their allies and shattering the fragile trust Manteo had worked so hard to build. The English were now almost completely isolated, surrounded by hostile forces and an unforgiving environment. The settlers quickly came to a single, terrifying conclusion. Without a significant and immediate resupply from England, they would not survive the coming winter. Their tools were breaking, their food was running out, and their diplomatic failures had left them with no allies to turn to. The city of Raleigh, conceived with such high hopes in the meeting rooms of London, was on the verge of total collapse. Faced with this impending catastrophe, the colonists concluded that their survival depended on sending a representative back to England on the ships that had brought them. This individual would need to act as their advocate, to plead their case to Sir Walter Raleigh, to secure a relief expedition, and to return with the food and supplies they so desperately needed. A great debate began among the settlers. Several men were nominated, but each refused. The journey was perilous, and the Atlantic in autumn was a treacherous place. More importantly, the men who had invested their entire fortunes and uprooted their families were unwilling to leave them behind. They wanted to stay and protect their investment and their loved ones. The logic of the situation soon became inescapable, and a consensus began to form. The colonists turned their attention to the one man with the authority, the connections, and the first-hand knowledge to make Raleigh understand the full gravity of their situation. They turned to their governor, John White. White refused immediately and vehemently. His journal records his powerful arguments against their request. He was their governor, his place was with them. To leave would look like an act of desertion, a flight from the hardship that he had led them into. He feared his enemies in England would use his absence to slander his name and undermine the entire venture. The colonists, however, were relentless. They put their request in writing, a formal petition signed by the leading settlers. They reasoned that the sailors of the fleet would listen to no one else, and that Raleigh would only respond to a direct plea from his appointed governor. They used every ounce of their persuasive power, appealing to his sense of duty and his love for his family. The final argument was the most powerful. They promised to protect his property, his maps and paintings, which he treasured. And they reminded him that he was the only one who could truly save his daughter, Eleanor, and his newborn granddaughter, Virginia. The choice was made impossible. To stay was to fail them as a governor and watch them starve. To go was to abandon them as a man and a grandfather, hoping a desperate gamble across an ocean would save them. With a heavy heart, John White finally relented. He agreed to make the journey. He would leave the 116 men, women, and children, his family, his colony, in the hope that by leaving them, he could ultimately save them. It was a governor's gambit, a decision that would become a private and a historical tragedy. Before his departure at the end of August 1587, John White and the colonists established a clear protocol. White knew that the colonists would likely need to move from their vulnerable position on Roanoke Island. They discussed moving 50 miles inland or seeking refuge with Manteo's people on CROATOAN Island. They needed a way to communicate their destination. The plan was simple and ingenious. If the colonists moved, they would carve the name of their new location into a prominent tree or post. This would be a clear message for White and the relief expedition, a beacon to guide their rescuers. It was a plan born of foresight and a shared understanding of their perilous situation. They also agreed upon a distress signal. If the colonists were forced to leave their settlement due to violence or an attack, they would carve a Maltese cross above the name of their location. The presence of the cross would signal that their move had been made under duress. The absence of the cross would mean that they had left of their own free will in a planned and orderly fashion. This agreement is the single most important and most frequently overlooked fact in the entire Roanoke saga. For John White, the carving of a place name was an expected outcome, a sign of a successful relocation. The presence or absence of a Maltese cross was the only detail that would indicate whether the colonists were in distress. This was their promise, carved in bark. With this plan in place, John White said his farewells. He left his daughter, his granddaughter, and the 114 other souls in the tenuous safety of the Roanoke settlement. He boarded the ship, promising a swift return with aid. As the coast of Virginia disappeared behind the horizon, he could not have known that he was seeing his family for the very last time. John White arrived back in England in November of 1587 to find a nation in the grip of a profound and existential crisis. All of the simmering tensions with Spain, the proxy wars of the Sea Dogs, and the religious strife of the Reformation were about to explode into open conflict. King Philip II of Spain had finally committed his empire's vast resources to a single cataclysmic objective: the invasion and conquest of England. His plan was called the Enterprise of England, and its centerpiece was the largest naval fleet Europe had ever seen. This was the Grande y Felicissima Armada, the great and most fortunate navy, later known to the English as the Invincible Armada. 130 warships, carrying 19,000 soldiers, were tasked with sailing from Lisbon to the English Channel. There, they were to rendezvous with an additional 30,000 veteran Spanish troops stationed in the Netherlands under the command of the Duke of Parma. This combined force would then cross the Channel, land in Kent, and march on London. The goal was to depose the heretic Queen Elizabeth, extinguish the threat of English privateering, and forcibly return England to the Catholic faith. For England, it was a moment of supreme peril. The nation was on a full war footing, its resources and its people mobilized for a desperate defense against a seemingly unstoppable superpower. The fate of the kingdom and the future of the Protestant Reformation hung in the balance. In this climate of national terror and total war, the plight of 117 colonists stranded 3,000 miles away became a tragically low priority. Despite the escalating crisis, John White worked tirelessly throughout the winter of 1587 to organize a relief expedition. He secured promises from Sir Walter Raleigh for a small fleet of ships. He gathered supplies and prepared to make the return journey as soon as the spring sailing season began. He held to his promise to his family. In the spring of 1588, however, his plans collapsed. As the Armada prepared to sail from Spain, Queen Elizabeth's government took a drastic but necessary step. A royal stay was issued, commandeering all seaworthy vessels of a certain tonnage for national defense. All private voyages, including Raleigh's planned relief mission for Roanoke, were cancelled or indefinitely postponed. Every ship, every sailor, every barrel of salted beef, and every pound of gunpowder was needed for the defense of the realm. The nation's very survival was at stake, and the resources of private ventures were conscripted into the national effort. Raleigh's ships were absorbed into the English fleet that would face the Armada. The lifeline to Roanoke was cut by royal decree. White, desperate, managed to secure 2 small pinnaces, ships that were too small to be included in the royal stay. He hastily outfitted them and set sail for Virginia. This private, underfunded attempt ended in disaster. The crews, motivated by profit, turned to piracy. They attacked a French ship, were defeated in the ensuing battle, and were stripped of their own cargo. The wounded and defeated ships limped back to England, their holds empty. This failed attempt was John White's last chance to reach his colony before the war began in earnest. He was now trapped in England, a helpless spectator to the great naval conflict that would decide the fate of nations, all the while tormented by the knowledge that his family was starving 3,000 miles away, waiting for a rescue that he was now powerless to deliver. In August of 1588, the English fleet, through a combination of brilliant tactics and favorable weather, defeated the Spanish Armada. The threat of invasion was over, and England was saved. For John White, the victory should have cleared the way for his return to Roanoke. It did not. The English victory, while decisive, led to a prolonged period of continued maritime conflict. The war with Spain dragged on for years, and English ships and investors remained focused on the immense profits to be made from privateering against the crippled but still wealthy Spanish Empire. Walter Raleigh himself had become deeply embroiled in the war effort and new court intrigues, and his attention was diverted from his failed American colony. Finding a ship and a captain willing to make the long, unprofitable, and dangerous journey to Roanoke became an almost impossible task. For 2 more agonizing years, John White petitioned, pleaded, and negotiated, trying to find a way back to his family. Every promise of a ship fell through. Every potential voyage was diverted to a more profitable venture. Finally, in 1590, he secured passage with a fleet of privateers bound for the West Indies. It was a deeply flawed arrangement. White was essentially a paying passenger, and the captains made it clear that their priority was raiding Spanish ships. The search for the colonists was a secondary objective, one they would only undertake if it was convenient. After 3 long years of silence, It was a desperate last-ditch effort, but it was the only chance he had. John White's return voyage in the summer of 1590 was a microcosm of all his previous frustrations. The privateering captains, led by John Watts, spent months successfully raiding Spanish settlements and capturing prize ships in the West Indies. For them, the voyage was already a resounding success. The agreed-upon side trip to Roanoke was now an irritating and dangerous final errand. As the fleet approached the Outer Banks in mid-August, they were hit by a powerful coastal storm. The treacherous waters off Cape Hatteras, known as the Graveyard of the Atlantic, nearly destroyed the expedition. One of the ships was wrecked, and 7 sailors drowned. This brutal introduction to the coast hardened the captain's resolve to conclude their business as quickly as possible. The privateering captains viewed the Roanoke search as an unprofitable detour, and they were eager to begin the journey home with their captured riches. They grudgingly agreed to grant John White a single day to search for his colonists. He would have to conduct his entire investigation, a search for 117 souls, under the immense pressure of a ticking clock. On the evening of August 17th, the night before his granddaughter Virginia's 3rd birthday, White and a small party of sailors rowed towards Roanoke Island. As they approached the shore in the growing twilight, their hearts soared. Through the dusk, they saw the unmistakable glow of a large fire rising from the northern end of the island, the very spot where the colony had been built. It was a sign of life, a beacon in the darkness. Through the darkness, the sailors sounded a trumpet and sang familiar English folk songs, hoping for an answer from the shore. They shouted and called out, their voices swallowed by the sound of the surf and the vast, dark woods. The fire offered no reply. There was no answering shout, no signal from a watchman. There was only the immense and unnerving silence of the continent. The landing was too dangerous to attempt in the dark, so White and his men were forced to spend the night anchored in the choppy sound. All night they watched the fire, a tantalizing and ambiguous signal. For White, it must have been a night of supreme torment, a battle between a desperate, rising hope that his family was just beyond the dunes, and a deep, creeping dread that the silent fire was a lure or a warning. At first light on August 18th, his granddaughter's birthday, John White landed on Roanoke Island. The fire they had watched all night was gone, leaving only smoldering embers and the deep silence of the forest. As his party made their way towards the settlement site, they found the first signs of the colonists. On a tree near the shore, the letters CRO were carved into the bark. This was the first part of the signal he was expecting, and it gave him a surge of hope. He pushed inland towards the high ground where the main settlement had stood. He found the entire area enclosed by a large and formidable defensive palisade, a tall fence made of tree trunks. This was new. The colonists had been busy and well organized after his departure. He found the entrance to the palisade, and there, on one of the main posts, was the full, clear message he had been waiting for. Carved in large Roman letters was a single word: CROATOAN. This was the name of Manteo's Island, a place of refuge. White's heart must have flooded with relief. This was the prearranged signal. Crucially, White searched the post for the agreed-upon distress signal, the Maltese cross. He found nothing. The absence of the cross was as loud as the carving itself. It meant that the colonists had moved to CROATOAN Island of their own volition, in a planned and orderly fashion. This was a message of survival. His men then fanned out to explore the enclosed settlement. The scene he discovered was one of deliberate and orderly abandonment. The houses had all been dismantled, a clear sign that the colonists had carefully salvaged the building materials for use at their new location. This was a planned relocation, the work of a community that was still organized and in control of its own fate. The area was overgrown with weeds and grass after 3 years of neglect, but there were no signs of a struggle. There were no bodies, no graves, no scorch marks from a battle. This was a deserted town, a ghost settlement, but it was not a scene of destruction. The clues all pointed to a community that had packed up and moved. White also discovered that several heavy iron bars, 5 cannons, and other weighty objects had been buried in the ground. This further reinforced his conclusion. The colonists, unable to transport these heavy items, had carefully secured them against a future return. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The colony was not lost. It had relocated. As the search party prepared to leave the empty settlement, John White made a final, personal discovery. He found his own buried chests, which had been ransacked by local natives. The looters had broken them open and left his life's work, his books, his maps, his priceless paintings, exposed to the rain and weather of 3 years. Despite this devastating personal loss, the message on the palisade gave him a singular purpose. He knew the destination. He hurried back to the ships, his heart filled with the renewed hope of a reunion on CROATOAN Island, a simple 50-mile journey to the south. He was a man who had found the clue and was ready to complete his quest. It was at this moment of maximum hope that the mission collapsed. The weather intensified into a full gale, and one of the fleet's primary anchor cables snapped under the strain. For the privateering captains, the choice was between a dangerous humanitarian rescue and protecting their immensely profitable cargo. The balance sheet won. The decision was absolute and final. Overruling the governor's desperate arguments, the captains ordered the fleet to abandon the coast and set a course for England. This single practical decision is the true source of the Roanoke mystery. The historical record was severed at this moment by the ultimate consequence of a privatized venture. The lifeline to the colonists was cut by a commercial decision. John White stood on the deck of the departing ship, watching the coast of Virginia recede for the last time. He had found the message, but was denied the reunion. Because of a broken anchor cable and a captain's greed, an orderly relocation was transformed by silence into a ghostly disappearance. He was forced to sail home with a solution in his mind, leaving behind a mystery that would capture the imagination of a continent for the next 400 years. John White sailed for England with a solution in his mind, a solution he was powerless to act upon. He was forced to leave that silent shore, but for us to understand the truth of what happened to his family, we must remain. We must now return to the evidence he discovered and analyze the single, powerful clue that has defined this story for centuries. The word CROATOAN is the central artifact of the Roanoke saga. For centuries, it has been treated as a cryptic utterance, a ghostly whisper from a vanished people. This modern interpretation, however, is a profound misreading of the evidence. To understand the message, we must see it through the eyes of the man it was intended for, John White. The word was carved prominently on the new defensive palisade. This location is itself a crucial clue. The construction of such a formidable structure shows that the colonists remained organized, industrious, and in command of their situation long after White's departure. They were a functioning community, capable of undertaking a major construction project to ensure their own security. This carving was the direct execution of the plan that White himself had co-authored. It was the positive half of the two-part signal he had explicitly requested. The colonists were informing their governor of their new location, just as he had instructed them to do. For White, the discovery of the word was a moment of profound relief and understanding. The destination itself was the most logical choice available to the colonists. CROATOAN was the name of the island home of Manteo, the colonists' most consistent and powerful native ally. It was a place of known friendship in a sea of uncertainty. To relocate there was to move from a hostile territory into a welcoming one, a place where they might be sheltered and fed. The message was a simple declaration of intent, a forwarding address left for a returning friend. It was the 16th century equivalent of leaving a note pinned to the door. It demonstrates that the colonists were active agents in their own story. They were making a rational, strategic decision to ensure their own survival. Later centuries, removed from the immediate context, would transform this clear signpost into a romantic mystery. The word, stripped of its original meaning as a simple destination, became a vessel for all of America's anxieties about its own origins. But for John White, standing before that palisade in 1590, there was no mystery. He knew where his colonists had gone. The word CROATOAN was only the first part of the message John White was looking for. His eyes scanned the wooden post, searching for the second, more urgent signal he and the colonists had agreed upon. He was looking for the one sign that would mean disaster: the Maltese cross. He had instructed them with absolute clarity. If they were forced to leave Roanoke in a state of distress, attacked by an enemy, or driven out by violence, they were to carve the cross above their destination. Its presence would be a cry for help, a warning of danger. White searched the post, his breath held in the silence of the empty fortress. But he found nothing. And in that moment, the silence of the carving spoke louder than any word. The absence of the cross was the message. It was a declaration, left by his family and his colonists, that they had not been attacked. They had not fled in terror. They had left in peace and in control of their own fate. This missing cross is the key that unlocks the entire scene. It is the colonists' own final testimony, a silent statement that refutes 100 years of speculation about a violent end. It transforms the abandoned settlement from a place of fear into a place of orderly transition. The colonists were not fleeing an attack. They were executing a planned migration to a safer and more sustainable location among their known allies. This interpretation is powerfully supported by the physical evidence within the palisade. The carefully dismantled houses, the buried heavy goods, and the absence of any human remains all tell the same story. This was a community moving house, taking everything of value with them and securing what they could not carry. The message of the palisade post was therefore one of profound hope. It told John White that his daughter, his granddaughter, and the rest of the settlers had been alive, well, and in command of their own destiny at the time they departed Roanoke. The problem was one of logistics, a search that needed to be completed, a search for a people who were waiting, not vanished. To follow the trail. John White could not. We must first understand the destination he was given. CROATOAN Island, known today as Hatteras Island, was the heartland of a distinct Algonquian-speaking people. They were the people of Manteo, the trusted friend and ally of the English since the very first voyage in 1584. The CROATOAN possessed a culture uniquely adapted to the challenges and opportunities of life on the Outer Banks. They were expert mariners and fishermen, masters of navigating the treacherous sounds and inlets in their dugout canoes. Their diet was rich in fish, shellfish, and waterfowl, resources that were less susceptible to the effects of the drought that plagued the mainland agricultural tribes. Their society was positioned at a cultural and geographic crossroads. They likely had more contact with other peoples, both native and European, than their inland counterparts. This experience may have made them more cosmopolitan in their outlook, more open to the possibilities of trade and alliance that the English represented. Manteo's own curiosity and willingness to engage with the newcomers is a testament to this worldview. For the struggling Roanoke colonists, CROATOAN represented their single best option for survival. It was a place of relative food security in a time of famine. It was the home of their only reliable native ally. And, at only 50 miles south of their abandoned settlement, it was an achievable destination for a community moving with women, children, and salvaged goods. The decision to relocate there was a logical and strategic one. It was an act of adaptation, a choice to move away from the failed English model of agriculture and towards the successful Algonquian model of maritime subsistence. The colonists were choosing to place their trust in the people of Manteo, hoping to weather the crisis by integrating into a more resilient native community. For centuries, the trail of the Roanoke colonists ended with John White's aborted search. The pursuit of a definitive answer was left to historians and mythmakers. In recent decades, however, a new kind of search has begun. Archaeologists, led by Professor Mark Horton and the CROATOAN Archaeological Society, have been systematically excavating sites on Hatteras Island, looking for the physical evidence John White was never able to find. Their work has focused on a large, ancient Native American village site near Cape Creek, a place known to have been the capital of the CROATOAN people. For years, the digs have uncovered vast quantities of native artifacts, confirming the site's importance as a major population center. And mixed in directly with these native materials, they began to find objects from a different world. The archaeological evidence reveals a pattern of late 16th century European materials integrated directly into a native domestic site. The finds include shards of English pottery, known as North Devon plainware, pieces of German stoneware jugs, and fragments of crucibles used for metallurgy. These are the types of everyday objects the Roanoke colonists would have possessed. Further discoveries have added significant weight to the argument. Archaeologists have unearthed a small piece of slate that was used as a writing tablet, along with a lead pencil of the type used by Thomas Harriot. They have found a gilt sword hilt, gun flints, and part of an English flintlock mechanism, all dating to the precise period of the colonists' arrival. One of the most compelling finds is a small gold signet ring, engraved with the image of a prancing lion or horse. It is of a style that was fashionable among the English gentry of the late 16th century. This was a high-status personal item, lost or traded by an Englishman living in a CROATOAN village. The sheer quantity and variety of these artifacts is crucial. These are household goods, industrial tools, and personal effects. Their context, found intermingled with native pottery and food remains in family dwellings, paints a clear picture. These are the material traces of English people living and working alongside the CROATOAN community. The evidence suggests a process of gradual assimilation. The colonists, likely arriving with few remaining possessions, would have been absorbed into CROATOAN households. They would have contributed their unique skills, like metalworking and firearms maintenance, to the community in exchange for shelter and sustenance. They survived by ceasing to be an independent English colony and by becoming part of a larger Native American one. This story of assimilation, written in the soil with broken pottery and rusted metal, was not the only record left behind. For over a century, the same story was preserved in a far more human archive, the living memory of the people who called Hatteras Island home. In 1701, an English surveyor and naturalist named John Lawson travelled through the region, documenting its people and environment. His book, A New Voyage to Carolina, provides a vital written link to the fate of the colonists. Lawson spent a significant amount of time on Hatteras Island, and he was struck by the unique characteristics of the local people. He noted that many of the Hatteras Indians had grey eyes, a feature that was remarkably uncommon among the purely Native American populations he had encountered elsewhere. He remarked on their quiet, civilized demeanor and their deep familiarity with English customs. During his stay, he recorded a remarkable story the local people told about their own origins. They told Lawson that several of their ancestors had been white people. They explained that these ancestors had come from Roanoke Island. This oral tradition, passed down through generations for over 110 years, was a direct and unambiguous account of their mixed heritage. Lawson's account is a priceless piece of the puzzle. It is the testimony of the descendants of the host community. It confirms that the English colonists were not wiped out, but were absorbed into the CROATOAN people, creating a new, blended community over the course of the 17th century. The grey eyes Lawson observed were the living, genetic echo of this union. This oral history also provides a name for the assimilated English. The Hatteras people claimed to be descended from the Powhatan, a name they used for the English, a linguistic echo of their connection to the wider Algonquian world. Lawson's work captured this history just before it faded. Soon after his visit, the Hatteras people were decimated by European diseases, and their population dwindled, taking with them the last living memories of the Roanoke saga. The combined weight of the evidence is powerful. The colonists' pre-arranged plan pointed to CROATOAN. The archaeological record shows English people living there, and the oral history of the native people themselves speaks of white ancestors from Roanoke. This consistent, multi-layered body of evidence tells a clear story of survival and assimilation for the CROATOAN contingent. The evidence for a group of survivors on CROATOAN is compelling, but it is unlikely to represent the fate of all 117 colonists. The archaeological finds on Hatteras are significant, but they do not suggest the arrival of an entire English town. The story of what happened to the colonists is likely a story of dispersal, of a community splitting up to improve its chances of survival. The key to this second story lies in John White's own account of his departure. He explicitly states that the colonists intended to move 50 miles into the Main. This was a core part of their contingency strategy, discussed before he ever left. The carving of CROATOAN explained the destination of one group, while this long-standing plan likely explained the destination of another. The target of this inland journey was almost certainly the territory of a powerful and friendly tribe, the Roanoke. Under their chief Manatanon, the Roanoke controlled the lands along the Chowan River. English explorers from the Lane colony, including Thomas Harriot, had previously made contact with this group and had found them to be sophisticated, well-supplied, and relatively open to an alliance. For a portion of the Roanoke settlers, the Roanoke offered a different kind of sanctuary than the CROATOAN. While the latter offered maritime security, the Roanoke controlled a vast inland territory with a powerful agricultural base. For colonists who still hoped to establish a farming community, an alliance with the Roanoke was a logical strategic move. It was an attempt to integrate with a powerful inland chiefdom. This theory posits that the Roanoke Colony split into at least two contingents. A larger group, perhaps composed of the core family units, sought refuge with their proven ally, Manteo, on CROATOAN Island. A smaller, more exploratory group, possibly containing more of the single men and artisans, traveled west to the Chowan River, carrying with them the tools and the ambition to forge a new settlement deep within the continent. For decades, the theory of an inland migration was supported only by circumstantial evidence and tantalizing but unproven artifacts like the Dare Stones. In the early 2010s, however, new archaeological research began to provide a scientific foundation for the hypothesis. Using advanced remote sensing techniques to re-examine John White's original map of the region, researchers discovered a hidden symbol. Beneath a patch on the map, modern imaging technology revealed the faint outline of a fort symbol located approximately 50 miles inland near the confluence of the Chowan and Roanoke rivers. This was a stunning discovery. It was a hidden clue from the 16th century, a cartographic X, marking a potential spot for a future settlement, a place the English had clearly identified as strategically important. This discovery prompted a new wave of archaeological investigation. Researchers from the First Colony Foundation began excavating a site known as Site X in Bertie County, near the location of the hidden fort symbol. The site was a known Native American settlement, but the archaeologists began to find a remarkable and highly unusual collection of European artifacts. The concentration of late 16th century English pottery, particularly a type known as borderware, is far greater at Site X than at any other known native village in the region. They have also found a small copper aglet, a metal sheath for a shoelace, of a type common in Elizabethan England. Other finds include fragments of a stoneware jar and a piece of a flintlock rifle. The evidence is still being analysed, but a clear picture is emerging. The artifacts found at Site X are the household and personal items of a small group of Europeans living within a Native American community. The pottery suggests English women were present, attempting to maintain their own domestic traditions. Much like at the CROATOAN site, the evidence points to a process of assimilation. The discoveries at Site X provide a powerful physical corroboration for John White's stated plan. They are the material footprint of a small group of colonists who followed the plan to move 50 miles into the mainland. They represent a second, distinct group of survivors who attempted to build a new life for themselves by integrating with the powerful Roanoke people. The story of the inland contingent does not end with the buried artifacts at Site X. 20 years after the Roanoke Colony was abandoned, the English returned to the Chesapeake Bay to found a new settlement, Jamestown. The accounts they gathered from the native population were more than mere rumors. They were pieces of geopolitical intelligence. Captain John Smith, the leader of the Jamestown colony, was engaged in a complex diplomatic relationship with the paramount chief, Powhatan. In these discussions, Powhatan made a calculated disclosure. There were men dressed like Smith living in the lands to the south under the protection of a rival chiefdom. This was a piece of strategic information, a way for Powhatan to map the political landscape for the newcomers and subtly signal the limits of his own authority. Another Jamestown colonist, William Strachey, provided an even more detailed piece of intelligence, gleaned from Powhatan's own court. He wrote that Powhatan had confessed to orchestrating a slaughter of some of the Roanoke survivors just as the Jamestown ships were arriving. This was a confession not of random violence, but of a calculated, preemptive strike. Seeing the new English presence as a long-term threat, Powhatan had made the ruthless political decision to eliminate the old one, preventing the two groups from ever joining forces against him. Strachey's intelligence, however, also noted that Powhatan's warriors had spared 7 of the English, Fowler men, 2 boys, and 1 Yonge maid. These individuals had escaped the massacre and fled up the CROATOAN River. This intelligence provides a potential explanation for the small, specific cluster of European artifacts found at Site X. It may have been the final home of this small group of refugees, the last known survivors of the inland contingent, living out their days after escaping Powhatan's purge. The Jamestown intelligence provides the final, tragic chapter in the colonists' story. It paints a picture of a group who survived for 2 decades, only to be consumed by the next phase of the colonial project they had begun. The Roanoke colonists were not lost. They were scattered, absorbed, and finally silenced by the complex and brutal power politics of a changing world. John White returned to England, a broken man. He had found the colonists' message, only to have the means of acting on it snatched away at the last moment. He would never be able to finance a return voyage on his own. The fate of his family now depended entirely on the continued patronage of Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh, however, was a falling star in the Elizabethan court. His secret marriage to one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, Elizabeth Throckmorton, had enraged the monarch. This act of personal defiance led to a period of royal disfavour and even a brief imprisonment in the Tower of London in 1592. His political capital and his financial resources were severely diminished. Despite his own troubles, Raleigh did sponsor at least one more expedition to the region in 1602. This voyage, however, was another example of privatized imperialism at its worst. The captains were distracted by the prospect of finding valuable sassafras root, and they ultimately abandoned the planned search for survivors in favor of short-term profit. It was the final, failed attempt. Raleigh's personal misfortunes and shifting political priorities led to the permanent abandonment of the search effort. After the death of Queen Elizabeth and the ascension of King James I, Raleigh's enemies conspired against him. He was accused of treason, sentenced to death, and spent the next 13 years imprisoned in the Tower. The original architect of the Virginia enterprise was now permanently removed from the board, and with him went the last real hope of a dedicated search for the colonists. For 200 years, the story of the Roanoke colonists was a historical footnote, a failed private venture that was eclipsed by the success of Jamestown and Plymouth. The clear message of CROATOAN and the accounts of survivors were recorded in the archives, but they were largely forgotten. History had moved on. In the 19th century, as the United States expanded westward and forged a new national identity, the story was rediscovered. It was repurposed by writers and historians to serve a new nationalistic narrative. The historical facts of assimilation with Native American tribes were inconvenient for an era defined by the policy of Indian removal and the ideology of manifest destiny. A new story was needed, one that kept the colonists purely English and tragically doomed. The lost colony myth was born. This new narrative transformed the story from one of survival and integration into one of a mysterious and total disappearance. It was a ghost story, a tale of a brave band of English pioneers who were swallowed by a savage, unforgiving wilderness. The figure of Virginia Dare was central to this new legend. She was recast as an American princess, a symbol of Anglo-Saxon purity. Folk tales emerged, like the story of the White Doe, which claimed she was transformed by native magic into a spectral deer that still haunted the forests of Roanoke. She became a figure of romantic tragedy. This mythologizing served a clear ideological purpose. It created a foundational story for the new nation that was tragic, heroic, and most importantly, racially pure. The uncomfortable reality of English colonists finding sanctuary by joining a Native American society was erased. The lost colony myth allowed 19th century Americans to claim the colonists as their first ancestors, without acknowledging any debt to or integration with the continent's native peoples. The cryptic word CROATOAN was stripped of its meaning as a destination and reframed as the central clue in an unsolved mystery. The absence of the Maltese cross, so crucial to John White's understanding, was forgotten entirely. The story became a haunting question: what happened? Precisely because the original clear answer was no longer culturally acceptable. The enduring power of the lost colony legend is what makes the historical reality so important. The legend is a story of mystery, of tragic disappearance, and of an unsolvable question. The history, as revealed by the archaeology and the primary sources, is a story of agency, of strategic thinking, and of survival through assimilation. The colonists of Roanoke were not a ghostly enigma. They were pragmatic people who, faced with a catastrophic drought and a lack of support, made a series of rational decisions. They split up. They sought refuge with known native allies, and they left a clear message explaining exactly what they were doing. They were active participants in their own survival. The story of Roanoke compels us to examine the process by which history is made and remade. The stories we choose to tell about the past often reflect more about the values and anxieties of our own time than they do about the past itself. A nation seeking to justify its expansionist destiny required a myth of a vanished people. A more inclusive and scientific age has recovered the more complex story of a people who survived by joining a new community. The ultimate fate of the Roanoke colonists is a story of adaptation and absorption. Their English identity dissolved over generations, their bloodlines merging with the native peoples who gave them sanctuary. They were not lost to the wilderness. They were lost to the historical record, their trail deliberately abandoned, their clear message ignored, and their story overwritten by a more convenient legend. The solution to America's oldest mystery was always there, carved on a wooden post, waiting for us to finally read it as it was intended. These documentaries are only possible because of the direct support of our community. If you believe in this mission and want to become a direct supporter of this channel, helping me bring more stories to life, please consider clicking the join button below. As always, thank you for your time and attention.